Welcome all to our Solibri Customer Insight webinar session. Do you all hear us well? If you don't hear us, please send the message to the chat. And please, if you have any problems, do send us a message. So this is the second session of our new Customer Insight webinar series. We will have this monthly. This time we have case study of project Tideway, a major infrastructure project situated in London that also won the BIM Project of the Year award last year. This webinar will also be recorded, and we will send you the link after the session and also post it on our YouTube channel. We will be your host today. Let us introduce ourselves. So I'm Vera. I work with partner management and sales, especially with Nordic countries and Baltic region.
Hi everyone, my name is Riina and I work as the product marketing manager here at Solibri, writing and telling stories about Solibri products and our customers and that kind of things.
Great to see that so many of you are here attending. I can see that we are 122 persons online. We wish you all that you can get some insights and new ideas and learn something during this webinar. And please, in the end, give us feedback so we can improve the future sessions. So you will get the link to the feedback form after the webinar. So what's on for today? We have a case study, Tideway, BIM Project of the Year. Nigel Davies will introduce that section. Then after Nigel's presentation, we have Solibri demo, which is connected to Nigel's project, given by Simon. And in the end, you have time for questions, and you can put them simply to that chat box. And so before we start Nigel's presentations, we would like to ask you to take our poll about your experience with Solibri. And you should see the question now on your screen. Please submit your answer, and let's wait for a minute to you to give your answers. All right, I can see here that, okay, changing still. Okay, so about 42% are the power users today. The same level is I have used a little bit Solibri, 10% of you. I have only seen others use it, and few of you have never used or seen Solibri. Thanks for replying.
All right, well, next we will go to the presentation of today. Nigel will share his experiences in the Tideway project. Let me give Nigel the turn to present. Just a second.
Should we meanwhile have Nigel's kind of background, or could you probably tell about consulting so we can get started?
Of course I can. Good morning, everybody. I'm Nigel Davies. I'm director with Evolve Consultancy in the UK. What our business does, it helps people adopt technology and use it in a more effective way. I'm now handing over. You should be able to now see my presentation.
Yes. I'm so sorry about that technical difficulty, but now,
Fantastic.
yes.
Oh, we're there. So we basically cover 5 main areas of business. We work with companies to implement information management and systems, working towards international standards and helping people adopt those. We deal with actually project information management as well, doing the work on a project, validating models, making sure the the exchange information requirements and the asset information requirements are completed. We also got a service that not many people actually realize we do. That's also modeling the project. And that's UK based so that we can integrate directly with the project teams. We also then deal with project technology. The old role or the traditional role of a CAD manager or a BIM manager inside an office, setting up software, helping it to be implemented and making sure it's configured specifically for projects. And then finally, we deal with training, covering a lot of software from Revit through Bentley tools and onto Solibri. We have, of course, last year now, apologies, awarded the BIM Project of the Year award through the Construction Computing Awards. That was in conjunction with Tideway and with Solibri, a joint effort between the three of us for this project that we're going to be going through today, the Tideway project. Just a quick overview of some of the clients that we work with. We work with architects, we work with engineers, both from the smaller practices all the way through to the large multidisciplinary international practices. We work with contractors, we work with client bodies, and we even work with software developers, Knowledge Smart being one that we use all the time for training needs analysis and recording. And of course, the one we're talking about today, Tideway.
And what about your background then, Nigel?
Oh, me? I originally trained in structural engineering, actually. I know it says 20 plus years there. It's actually nearer 25 that I've been working in the industry. Longer than that now, yikes. Working in engineering and architecture, and then over the last 15 years working with my own practice, Evolve Consultancy, to help people develop their technology. I was a member of the PAS 1192 Part 2 Steering Committee, and now recently I have joined the UK BIM Alliance guidance focus group for helping the documentation get put together for guidance and explanation of the standards. And most recently, I've joined the UK BIM Alliance Communities Leadership Team. Written a couple of books, but here are some of the more exciting projects that I've been involved in. 20 years old actually this year, the Millennium Dome as it was then, the O2 Arena now in London.
Great. What about the Tideway project then? Can you tell us something about that and what your role in that project is?
Yeah, of course. So this is what we're actually talking about. It doesn't look too glamorous from this shot, but these are the original sewers that currently sit underneath London and carry the waste out through into the Thames. The Tideway project itself is a large exercise to replace the existing Victorian sewers, which were actually created back in 1858 by Sir Joseph Bazalgette. It's the same sewers that were put in then, following the Great Stink of London in 1858, when London was actually home to about 2 million people. Now, when the original sewers were designed, Bazalgette had the foresight and he created them for a population about twice that size, about 4 million people. We're now at 9 million. The sewers have reached capacity, and this whole project is about replacing the original sewers that you see here below ground level, feeding out into the Thames, taking them down through a series of drop shafts and out through a tunnel below the Thames as part of the effort to clean up the whole area and return the Thames to a previous enjoyable state, is the way I'll put it. It's actually 25 kilometres of tunnel that stretch across the whole of London, carrying tens of millions of tonnes out and across into the outfall at the end of the Thames. It's actually divided into 24 work sites, and it's being run by 3 major works contracts. We've got a team over in the west, in the central and the east, and then also systems integration as well. So there's a lot of work going on. In terms of time frame, you can see it's got a long way to go. Construction started back in 2016. We're about here now, about 2020. So through construction, we're actually about halfway through, but there's a lot of more work to go on afterwards. by the time we get to 2022, we start the system commissioning, and in 2024, the work's completed, and actually there's a handover from the main works contractors to Tideway when the start of a 3-year period of Tideway's responsibility to maintain the assets and then Thames Water to actually operate them. The final handover of assets to Thames Water doesn't actually take place till 2027. So there's an awful lot of work left to do yet. It's a very time-consuming project.
Yeah, but very interesting as well. So you have this open BIM approach in your project. What does that mean? How do you utilize this open BIM?
Yeah, so from the start, we were involved before 2016 in this. We had to look at the way the information was going to be delivered. Now, before we even start talking about open BIM, it's worth just a consideration of the size of information that we are dealing with. On the client Tideway server itself at the moment, there are over 175,000 documents, which equates to around about 1.5 terabytes of data. That's just the Tideway CDE. When you consider there's all the different main works contractors and they're managing information coming in from their consultants and their delivery teams, we're talking about a huge amount of information. There was no way at the start we were going to actually expect that to be delivered in a single piece of software. So right from the start, we actually agreed to look at standard delivery methods rather than actually enforcing certain types of software on people. Here's a quick little diagram of the way our documentation goes together across the project. We have the final asset requirements from Thames Water right at the top, which are fed down into a response back to them, our BEP, but more importantly, the information specifications that were sent out to all of the tendering contractors in order to produce their information. Now, what we agreed on and what we say in that is that we would presume there were 3 major authoring suites being used, that being Autodesk, Bentley, and Graphisoft. At the time, what we decided was that we would look at open methods of delivering the data so that the delivery teams were free to use whatever software they required to get the job done. Hence, we decided on IFC COBie because they are open ISO standards, and that's one of the more important things that we dealt with. Was that we needed them to be backed by an international standard. So here's an extract from the Works Information 7600 itself, which actually describes that very, very quickly, and also bringing into account as well 3D PDFs so that people who don't have the technology to understand the IFC and COBie formats can still interpret the information. Now, at this point, we started to get concerns raised back. You've all heard them, I'm sure. IFC is not suitable for infrastructure. Our software can't export IFC. IFC does not support complex geometry. IFC was designed for vertical construction. Well, in terms of what we're asking for, if we look at the project, we'll see it's actually a series of concrete structures and drainage systems. And in fact, when we look back at this, first thing we identified was that these are international standards and they are actually designed for more than just buildings. They're also intended, and these are definitions from the IFC and from COBie themselves, clearly they're intended for those types of projects. But in terms of this, trying to put it down, we actually did look at this, and it's interesting to note that inside of IFC there are 12 building element types, but 56 distribution elements. And that's what we're talking about here. It is just a series of structures and a distribution system. Admittedly, it's a very large distribution system, but in the end, it is just IFC flow segments, IFC flow controllers, IFC walls. I'll translate that. That's pipes, valves, and walls.
Okay. So how about Solibri? In which phases of the project do you use it, and how do you use it in the project?
Well, we've been using Solibri throughout the project to look at data and to analyze it. But as we're moved in construction and we're aiming now towards Gate 6 handover, that's when we're actually really talking about stepping up the pace and looking at validation and verification of models that are being issued to us. We're working on the client side. We need to make sure that the model information that is being delivered matches the documentation and particularly the asset registers that are coming in. Now, what we did to do that is we've broken down each of the sites into zones, spaces, floors to help it. What we could have done is just turned around to the whole project and said, do you know what, there's your requirements, get on and do it. But we've realized that working towards a common aim is going to get the best for everybody. So what we have done in this case, and what the client Tideway has done, is we've produced a series of documents that help people understand how the information should be structured, not just information requirements, but guides on how we would hope that the information is put together. And particularly here, what we've done at the end, you can see my cursor here on this one here, which we'll go through in more detail later, is actually completely produce a list of the complete verification checks that we'll be going through. But we had to go all the way back to basics, looking at the model coordinate systems, which people who know me in the UK know that's one of my pet hates in the industry, is that coordinate systems shouldn't be difficult, but sometimes they are. We're not having problems with coordinates on this project. That's one thing that we've got to the bottom of right at the start, but moving through the project now, as it comes up through this, how the models are structured, how the IFC information is structured, and finally how information is going to be handed over at gate 6, that's the important part for us. This is what's important. It's the structure of the data, not necessarily the tools that have been used to produce it. So what we've been doing is been working with the main works contractors, everybody involved in the project, to try and identify where things can be achieved and where things have been a little more difficult, and working through those problems. I'll talk a bit more about the process, the way we did that later, but to us, we took the original systems diagrams and we looked at them, and the way they break down into IFC structures in COBie is actually fairly straightforward when you review them in this way. This is work that we did as part of an internal review to see whether this approach was actually pragmatically possible, all the way down to the final components that actually sit in the project and are identified through the spaces. We moved on from that then, and we're starting to look now at how the asset tags need to be formalized, and making sure that they can be identified consistently across all the sites and all the main works contractors. Now, the way we've done that is built a series of guides, as I've said, and highlighted and tried to be as transparent as possible with the compliance checks that are going to be run on the project, so that they can be reviewed up front and the information that come into us is as complete and as successful as possible. Here's an excerpt of the workflow that the models are going through. And here are just some of the identifications in the validation checks that we're doing, which are a simple yes, no answer. Has the information been received? Is there evidence of the validation carried out before the information comes into us? What our intention is, because there's so much information on this project, is to do spot checks on the information. We simply couldn't validate everything. That's the main works contractor's role. It's their information to tell us it's correct, but we will be doing just spot checks on this to make sure that the information is complete and that the assets within it are where we expect them to be.
Yeah, okay, so yeah, what are the benefits, what you have seen so far?
Okay, the first thing I'll start with before we go on is we couldn't do this without Solibri. We absolutely couldn't. If we remind ourselves about how much data we're talking about on just the client side at the moment, there's no way even a cursory spot check could be done this way manually. There's simply too much information. So we've worked really hard on putting the environment together in Solibri to be able to automate the verification process and validation and tell us exactly what's going on. And the way we've done that is through a series of collaborative workshops where we have tested this approach to destruction, is the phrase that we've been trying to use. We worked together with each of the main works contractors, worked through the information requirements and the structures of IFC, and looked at how problematic that would be to deliver it. And through those checks on the IFC files, what we were trying to identify was one of 5 things. We were trying to work out whether the problems that were coming were to do with the modeling of the project, whether it's something to do with the configuration of the software or settings issue to do with the IFC export, whether there was a workaround that was possible to actually achieve something, whether actually, and this is the one that worried us more, whether there were, I'd say, bugs in the software that actually meant the IFC couldn't be produced. To be fair, what we find, we didn't find one action in this initial workshops that actually couldn't be resolved. What we're finding was simple things to do with the structure of IFC that are easily resolvable. Things like this example here, where two spaces are identified with the same name. We went through it, we found that most things were surmountable, and we're at the point where actually we're confident moving forward that it can be done. And all of this is actually done inside of Solibri. Just a quick summary here, as we work through an excerpt again from the validation checks that we did as part of these workshops, you can see that we come to the last one here, and a lot more of these are whys. Still a long way to go on the project yet, but we are getting there.
Yeah. So what's next? What are the next steps in the project?
Well, the next steps from our side of things are the most technical. What we've got to do now is start bringing all of the asset information into the models and making sure that the handover to Thames is as complete as possible. And the way we're doing that, without going into the standards in too much detail, is to make sure that the information requirements are, again, clear, they're understandable, and they're built into the Solibri operations. So what you've got here is a couple of what are called hierarchy codes to identify the assets within the models. Each of those, what we're trying to do at the moment is trying to map those to the ideal IFC entity that is used to produce those. That's never going to be complete. It's never going to be a one-to-one mapping, but at least there's some kind of guidance as to the entities that we're looking at. And here you'll see inside of our Solibri environment, exactly mapped is exactly the same thing, so that we can check that the elements we're dealing with are one of the expected asset location tags, they're called here, hierarchy 1 and hierarchy 2. We're also working on trying to rationalize the terminology used. If you're aware of IFC and COBie to any extent, you'll know that some things are called actually, totally different things, stories and floors, buildings, facilities being two examples. But also in the asset information terms, they're a little bit more English in their approach. So what we've been doing is building mapping tables to make sure that the information is identifiable in each of the models. And this, again, it's an excerpt from the guidance that says, this is where we would expect things, but it's not dictated. At any time, we can receive information back. And so long as we're being told consistently where that information is, we can work with it. In the end, there are 3 main works contractors that we're dealing with. That's only 3 different possibilities, but they are working together to try and make sure they're the same information as well. We can work with it. It's not a problem at all. So the next thing is to actually get in and start looking at these models as they work through stage 5 and work towards the handover at the end of gate 6. What we've done is built a series of classifications and checks which align directly with the documentation. You can see it here a little bit here, is that everything's got a reference number. But if I just jump quickly into Solibri, it will become a little bit clearer to see. So this is a proof of concept model that we've been working with over the last few months to actually identify the asset tags and how it will look for handover. And we've got here a series of IFC and COBie checks that we're working through. These numbers here directly relate to the section in the Gate 6 compliant checks documentation that we put together, so that at any point we can refer back to it and look at exactly which parameters of properties are being checked, how they're being checked, and what we expect for compliance. That's proven really invaluable to us, and hopefully it will as the information comes to us to the feedback and reviews that we give on the information when it's actually received. So you can see here under the asset tag that we've got a series of different checks that are going through to make sure that all the information aligns and is correct. It's a lot of work still to do, but it's very enjoyable. I must admit, this is the kind of thing that I really enjoy doing.
Yeah, that's good. How would you summarize your experiences so far?
Summarizing is pretty easy, to be honest. I think the more effort you put in up front with defining your requirements clearly, you're going to get more success at the end. And the one thing that we really emphasize is trying not to limit the tools being used. The delivery teams are those who are the experts. What you need to really concentrate is understanding and using open methods of delivery to make sure that everybody can achieve the same end goal. But it's really important to understand IFC properly. It's not just a DXF of the 21st century where you can hit a button and hope that your curves and arcs are represented well enough. There's far more to it. It's about knowing how the software needs to be set up to deliver an effective IFC. And remember, infrastructure isn't an excuse. Infrastructure can be done. There are more challenges on certain types of infrastructure project, and not to be flippant, infrastructure covers a wide variety of projects. But in this type of thing, it's proven that actually it's not an excuse. Clearly, though, the data itself is useless unless it's validated and verified. That's where Solibri steps in for us. And the one lesson I'd say to everybody out there is, so long as you can define the checks that you work with is clear logic, your simple yes or no's, even if they are complicated questions, breaking them down to clear logic, it's easy to automate this inside of Solibri. And it's not just physical or data checks you can do. There's so much more that you can do that's worth looking at. But above all, work together, work collaboratively. You're trying to achieve the same end result, which is a successful delivery. Don't act as different sides of the fence, all work together, try to get the best out of the project. That's all I can say.
Great. Thank you so much, Nigel, for going through the Tideway project so far and sharing your experiences.
Thank you.
If any of the attendees, if you have questions for Nigel, you can pop them into the chat, and we will have a moment to answer some of the questions after in the end of this session. What we will do next, we will have a Solibri demo. So
yes, could you, Simon, briefly describe what you have on the demo?
Okay, so you can see my background there. I've been working closely with customers and consultants like Nigel for the last sort of 20 plus years, generally aiding projects. In the demo today, what we're going to look at is the proof of concept for data delivery on the Tideway project, just to show you some of the basic functionality of the Solibri COBie extension, and then to try and keep it a little bit more generic so that some of the concepts that are used within that framework can be used on any project. I'm going to show you how that the use of classifications, which we've already seen from what Nigel's shown with some of the data validation, basically can be used on any project and add flexibility. So that's the key thing we're going to show.
all right, we'll hand over to you.
Okay. Okay, so hopefully you should be seeing my screen now.
Yes, I think so.
Okay, so based on the information and the structuring of the data for the Tideway project, as explained by Nigel, we can take a quick look at that project and how the COBie data was created to verify the asset information requirements, and how it can actually be delivered in a structured manner. For those of you who are not aware of COBie, it stands for Construction Operations Building Information Exchange. Its primary function is to provide location and associated data for components that are required for planned preventative maintenance tasks. And it makes sense to actually capture this information during the design and build phases of a project rather than trying to collect it once the building has been commissioned. Essentially, elements that are deemed to be part of the asset information requirements can be assigned relevant additional data that will assist the owner or manager to carry out their maintenance schedules, essentially understanding for the elements what space and what floor and level of the building they can be accessed from, along with other information such as manufacturing data, installation dates, commissioning dates, spare parts, resources, and so on. The tasks can be obviously grouped using zoning functionality and systems. So for the COBie extension, so what we'll do is just move over to our Solution Center area here. The COBie extension is provided free of charge for the Solibri Office users. It consists of the extension itself, which is the COBie platform over here, and a set of resources. And these are split at the moment via either the COBie US resources or the UK resources that allow us to actually then deliver a quality COBie output. The difference between Solibri and many other applications that produce COBie is the ability to pre-process the COBie output from a federated model. allowing the users to interrogate and visualize the data in a visual context. So basically, the steps are to define your included assets based on your asset information requirements for the project, check the mappings that are required, and then run the rule sets to check any check and communicate any missing data. So now we can go back over to the COBie tab here, which gets installed when we install the extension, and we can see some of the data that's on this proof of concepts for the Tideway project. Be aware that that this was set up in order to actually check for mapping, and so you can see that the data isn't fully complete in here, or also correct in this early proof of concept stage. But when we now look at this, so we've now once we've defined the items that are actually going to make the COBie sheet, then we can actually run the calculation function. Now, the COBie extension is essentially, if I go to the settings, a set of information takeoffs that will run sequentially and then populate them into the template sheet here. So here are our ITOs, or information takeoffs, that will actually be used to deliver into the sheets themselves, and they will then push into the template, which we can define at the top here. So we can obviously edit those related to projects, or if we've got additional columns that needed to be added to the template, we can add them there as well. Okay, so once we've now calculated it, and if we start looking at the relevant sheets here, we're now on the floor sheet, and the floor sheet will show the levels within the building. And when we click on it, it's interactive. So as we click between the different levels, we can see the types of components that are actually based on those levels in the structure. Same goes for the spaces. So when we click on any of these spaces, we can see the spaces. We can highlight multiple columns or rows in the sheet. But also, if we select any particular item within the model and we want to look at the data and where that relates in the sheet, we can also use the bidirectional sort of functionality as well to go back to the sheet to find that particular row in question. If we look at the components in here, which are all related to the types and also have relationships to the systems as well, if I double click on this one here, I'll hide this first space here, and we can then look at what this component is. So we'll make this transparent, and we can see here we've got a access ladder, and the access ladder is shown as the context in the model against the space that it sits in. We can, if we wanted to, then trace that back, and we can click on the actual space there. You've seen that we can actually look at the relevant space that it relates to by actually finding that within the model, but also we might want to know what zone that relates to as well. So we can see that's actually in the shafts area here. So very, very interactive sort of functionality to check the data that's in the background and help you deliver that COBie deliverable. It gives you plenty of flexibility on that. What I'm going to do now is move over and show some of the concepts that sit behind that, but also from a more generic point of view. So if I go back to my my recent list here, I'm just going to close this model down. And I'm going to open up this data example here, which is actually fundamentally a COBie based, this is our example model, and this is sort of the second part of the demonstration now. It's set up, and initially we have a set of COBie assets, which show us the elements that are going to actually make COBie in this case here. And these are then used to drill down to the other pieces of data. So what we're going to do is look at the use of classifications to aid rules and to give flexibility to the users, where they might want to actually grab data from different locations, or they might want to actually use compliance lists, that type of thing, in order to make the rules as flexible as possible. So we're going to look at two particular fields here. The first one, which is the asset type, and the second one, which is a classification, which in this case is based around Uniclass, but could be based around any country's sort of specification requirements. So if we look at the asset type, first of all, a relatively simple field for the elements that are shown on screen. What we actually have is one of two values, which is fixed or movable in this case here. You can see that what we've got is elements that are fixed, And we've also got elements that are unclassified, i.e. they haven't had the value applied to them, or we might not have mapped them correctly. So the whole idea with the classification, if we go to its settings, is that in the classification rules, what we can do is we can add a number of columns to use for a criteria function to check for different locations for the data. So if we were delivering COBie and we wanted to put it into the location which was specified as sort of maybe a default location, although as you say, as Nigel alluded, it's not essential to have it in those locations. In this case, what we do is we look at each component which gets pushed through to this classification, and we then for each component basically we run through the rows in this table. And the first one it comes to is it looks for COBie underscore asset type. And if it finds a value there, then we use the value. So the equals to actually says grab the value from the actual second column. If not, then we can look here, which is in the data COBie type asset. And this is like basically a default Revit based field if you're using the COBie extension for Revit, if they haven't mapped their data on the way out. So in this case here, we've got the second row, which says go and grab it from this location. Now, that gives us a combined list from different locations, which we can then use within a rule to check the data. So if we go to the checking area now and we look at the type-based fields, you can see that we have asset type here. And what that does, when we open up the rule checks the same sets of data that are the assets. And then what we do then is we can then specify that this classification and the values that come from that classification have to be one-off, fixed, or movable. And then what we do is break those down into the types. So the big difference here is that we end up with a list of results that are related to types in this case here, rather than actually individual components. So that was still a little more of a simple sort of version, but where we end up with a larger list here, for instance, if we look at the COBie category here, what we've got is our product values, and this particular field requires each of the elements that are then part of COBie to actually have a uniclass value applied to them. In this case, a product value, and we can see we've got from the list of the items that should contain the data, we have a set of unclassified values. When we get the unclassified values in here, we end up with a list of each of the individual components that are unclassified, not necessarily the based on type. In this case here, what we're going to do is, if we look into the settings for this, it's a slightly different sort of setup here. Whereas before we were just actually specifying the location to go and grab the data. In this case here, the classification is doing a large amount of the grunt work as far as the validation of the data that's there. So for instance, what we've got is a set of values here, again in two columns, because we're checking for two different locations where this data may exist. And then we actually have then the valid values that are allowed for these components. Now we could break that down later on and actually go further, and like what Nigel showed, which was to say actually, well, these particular PR values should only be related to certain types of components. If I scroll down, you'll notice it goes from the most granular down to the least granular, then the list actually repeats basically here. Now, in the classified areas, you can see the items that have been classified. We can see our doors and windows in this case are classified, but there's been nothing classified from the Revit model itself. Now, if I click on one of these air terminals here, and I look at the data information that's required for it, we're checking this location here in the classification rules. And you'll notice that if I go down to the information within that area, COBie type category, you'll see that we've got not available, not applicable here. But you can see they've put the data in, but it's just in a different location. So this gives us flexibility in order to say, well, we know they're placing the data here, or that consultant's placing the data there on a regular basis. So what we will do in this case is just change that location. So we'll say, okay, it's still coming from data, but now we're looking at it from the uniclass PR number value here and say, okay. Now that automatically, when we go over to the classified area, means now we end up with these elements now classified. So, and the benefit here also is that if the tables change, so in the case of Uniclass tables, they're still in a state of flux where they're being improved all the time, or your requirements for the project change on the relevant sort of fields that you're checking the data for, then you can obviously update those using the Excel functionality here. So the ability to then, so if we grab all of the data in the sheet, and I'm just going to remove it all, what I can do is I can use the Excel import function to go and grab that information. So what you do need is a Excel sheet with the same set of data in there that you're trying to import in. If we have a multi-tab sheet, then it would be one of three, and it would ask us to pick the tab first of all. In this case, it's now saying one of two. So the first one is to say, okay, which column actually matches with which column from the spreadsheet. So if you name, so here's our column in the spreadsheet, which is on row number 1, and this is what it's going to map to with inside the classification function. So as long as you name them the same, it will dynamically map. If you've got different names for them, then you need to manually map these across. Once you've gone through that mapping process, if you hit the next function, you can then select the rows to import. So we've selected from row 2 right the way down to this one here, 14,755. We hit the finish button and it pulls the data into that classification. So because it's using first match, just be aware that first match means that it will go through the table. Once it finds a match, it will then apply the classification name. And in this case here, you saw with the example that Nigel gave that whether or not it was accepted or not as far as the criteria. In this case here, when it's accepted and it has a value here, we're giving it the concatenated version of the name and the reference of the two parts of the field that make up Uniclass. Whereas best match would run through the whole table first of all until it found the best match on the relevant columns. So always try to use first match if you can do, because obviously it's much quicker. And then in the settings table here, we also then have this show unclassified, which means it gives us the ability to actually see the elements that are not classified now. So when we click on OK, you can see now we've got a larger list of these values, whereas before we had just the doors and the windows. Now we've got the air terminals, but we have an unclassified set of data of these components that are still missing the information. So if we go back to our checking area now, and I hit check the model here, and I click on the category for the Uniclass, and then I look at the rules to do with this now. The difference between this is that the classification is doing all of the work. So we've got our data that we're actually saying this is the elements that we're going to check, which is the same as the classification. And then we also have then the requirements. Now the requirements can now be really easy. So what we do is we say include any component that is from this classification, and we're then saying it must be defined. Now, defined means it's classified. You'll notice that you can do is undefined as well. And the idea behind that is that you can actually check what undefined or defined sets of elements. And then again, we break those down to type. Now, the idea with this is that the rule can stay static, and you can change the inputs and allow the classification to do the actual work, because you wouldn't want to be putting the value lists into this list here. So it makes the rules really really focused basically on just delivering what the classifications are doing. And then what we end up then with is the ability to then create the relevant slides, in this case here, for those elements that are missing the data, in order then to communicate that with the consultants to actually fix those problems. So we'll just create the last one here, and then what you can do is right click on the make a presentation. By making the presentation, we can see that we've created the relevant slides that are linked back to the actual rules, so we can check whether they've been completed or not when we get the next iteration through. And we can then report those via VCF, or we can synchronize them to any of the issue management servers. Okay, that sort of concludes the demonstration from my part. I'll just check whether there's any questions.
Yeah, I see that at least one for Nigel, I think. But please, if you have any questions for us, either regarding the demo or for Simon or then to Nigel, just write to the chat and we'll go them through next. So what we have here for Nigel, you have produced a lot of documentation in the project, like the guidance documents and all that. Can you estimate how long that has taken you in the project doing all that documentation?
Great question. Putting into context, we've been working on the project now for 7 years, 6 years. This documentation has only been produced recently and it's being developed as we go along. In terms of hours of time to put it together, it's not a great deal in respect to the size of the project. And we were talking a couple of days to get the documentation together. It's stuff that falls, as you're doing the work, it falls together naturally. All we're really doing is recording what we're putting into, in terms of Solibri, in terms of the checks, we are just recording them in the document. So couple of days per document, I guess. Making sure that it's authorized, there's all the checking side of things to make sure they are complete. And of course, there will be updates as we go through this next phase and identify where exactly how the asset tags are going to be delivered. They will be updated, but it's not a considerable amount of effort, not at all.
Yeah, are there a lot of pages in those documents?
Some of them are. I mean, if we take the information requirements out of the picture because they need to be produced at the start, they vary. So the coordinates document, for example, is about 4 or 5 pages. It goes through the main 3 different tools that we expected to be delivered, and AutoCAD as well, actually. And it just goes through an ideal way that we would expect the coordinate systems to be set up. Simple guidance, keep it as short as possible. So yeah, 4 or 5 pages. When we come on to the compliance checks, that's more like 20 pages, I guess, because it explains exactly which parameters are being used and how they relate to each other and where they are intended to end up with when they go out to COBie. So they're not considerable documents. We've tried to make them as clear and concise as possible, else they won't get used.
Great, thanks, Nigel.
No problem.
Simon, are you seeing any good questions there that we could go through still?
Sorry, I'm not seeing any questions in the interface at all.
Okay.
It's blank.
So we will go through a few of them. There is a question, is it possible to get a material list out of Solibri? Then we can use that for our calculation, and they are saying that we are a construction factory.
Okay, so they're looking for more for information takeoffs. Okay, do you want to give me?
Yes, I can give you the, yeah, so you can show how it's done. Go ahead.
Okay, so basically the functionality we're looking at here is the information takeoff functionality. Essentially what it does is it gives us the ability to list any kind of information, and essentially that's what we've just shown within the COBie delivery function. It gives us the ability to load up any amount of the different sort of definitions of these, so they can be generic or they can be very basic. So if I take you through a very, very basic example, so if we create a new information takeoff, and if I want to grab then say columns, for instance, I can narrow this down to individual elements or relate it to more generic components. So if I want to grab columns, I can also enable grouping, which means that if the data in the sheet is the same, then it will actually try and group those rows together. Or if we did one component per row, what it actually does, it splits those out into individual rows. So if I say okay to that, what it will do automatically is it will go through the actual model, grab anything that is a column in this case here, and then show us the type and the count and the number of these values. So by default, it gives us a very basic structure, which is like just those 4 columns. But you might want to then say, okay, well, I want to add another column in because I actually want to grab some quantity data. Now, in this case here, we're going to use the quantity information that's been generated via the import functionality. So we have 2 sets of quantity information. First set of quantity information is basically generated via Solibri based upon the geometry we've imported. And then we would have property set information as well, which would be base quantities in here. So if we go up to the top here, you'll also notice that we have our base quantities, and the base quantities are generated by the authoring piece of software. I'm going to grab them from our quantity area here. Now, you might want to do a comparison between those two values just to check that actually we haven't got anything sort of wildly different between what we've calculated and what the authoring system has calculated. So in this case here, what we'll do is we'll go and grab the length of those columns. Now, we actually want the height of the columns, but obviously the value is called length, but we can actually change that if we wanted to. So we can call this column. So you don't have to have the same name for the that is defined within the system. So now we can see we've got column height in here. Now, when we do a takeoff, what it does now is it runs through that and it actually tells us what type of those columns we've got and the values. Now, what it's doing here, based upon the actual column height itself, it's doing a summation of those values. So when I double click here, you'll notice I've just copied the header so I don't have to retype it again next time. But notice that it's doing sum. Now we can have maximum, minimum, or average, and it'll actually work out those for us. Or we can actually say, let's group that value. Let's paste the value back in again. And this is probably a little bit more of what you might want to see. So what it's actually saying is for this particular row here, these particular columns, and again, interactive, when you double click on any of these, you can actually see those values. It's telling us that actually of these columns here, we've got 5 of them, and they're at each one is at 3.5 meters. So hopefully that answers a little bit of the question as far as the basics of how we would carry out information takeoffs.
Okay, thank you, Simon. We have still time for a few questions. So these are actually to Nigel. Let's take the first one. So would you typically check individual models or federated models?
In this project, it's all reliant on what we're actually receiving. We are expecting federated models on this project to actually check them through. Typically, when we're working on a project, we would do the checks on models before we federate them, only because it's easier then to report the information back to the original authors to make sure that they're getting the information to us. We try to avoid federating information that hasn't been validated, because that could have an effect on the overall federation of the project and the validation of that side of things. So while on this project we're reliant on what we're receiving, which is defined in the main works contractors BEPs, typically we would work on individual models before we federate them. I know that's different depending on who you talk to. That's just the way we work because it's easier for our workflows.
Okay, thanks, Nigel. Another question is there any further definition on how the end operator on Tideway will use the IFC files?
There is. We're in the process at the moment of producing the final BEP to refer back to Thames Water and work out how the information is going to be delivered to them and how it's going to be used. That is part of the next steps of the project to make sure that we've got that finalized. So not actually that much I can share on that at the moment.
Okay, and then one question about collaboration. How do you share all information with the team?
Through the project common data environment. There are a number of different environments on this project, and again, one of the things that we discuss in the UK quite often is that a common data environment might not be a single solution, it may be multiple systems. So each of the main works contractors have got their own common data environment based off of project-wise, where the information is stored and shared between the parties. The client has also got the same, a project-wise common data environment where the information is stored, but also we're using document stores additionally on top of that. A-Site is one that's being used heavily on this project. SharePoint is being used on this project. There are a number of different data sources how the information is stored. So in terms of the documentation and the guidance that is available on the project, they are all just made available on the common data environment to people to pull down and use as they need. It's very well organized. There's an awful lot of data to organize though.
Okay, thanks a lot, Nigel.
Thank you.
One last question to Simon. Is it possible to make an Excel sheet from that material information?
still see the screen?
I can switch over for you.
Okay.
There you go.
Okay, so the answer to that question is yes. So the report functionality here on the end gives us the ability to export that sheet. When we hit the report button, it gives us the ability to use a plain Excel report or an Excel template report. So if we do a plain Excel report, first of all, we'll save that report and we'll just put that onto my desktop a second here. That should fire up at Excel in the background and actually produce the export. So hopefully you can you see this on the screen? So we can see that what we've got is an exact replica of the data that's actually within the model itself. Now, what you can do is that you can, when you hit the report function this time, you can actually you can use a template, so something that you've already actually pre-processed in Excel. Might have additional functionality and extra sort of functions and calculations within Excel that you're using. So if I say create a default template, and we'll stick that on the desktop as well, the difference between this one will be that it grabs the actual values. Whether I can actually zoom in a little bit here, make that a little bit, whether I can actually go into, let's choose, there we go. So hopefully that's a little bit clearer. So what this gives us is the ability that you set up your information takeoff first of all. You can then go and put in your own images and your own sort of headers and information to do with the actual model itself. Anything in brackets basically is are the fields within Solibri, and it doesn't stop you then actually creating functions which use these fields and add additional data, so that actually what you're doing is pre-populating information into a template, which would then drive other functionality based upon that information. So yeah, so in essence, yes, you generate the data from the report functionality for that particular information takeoff. Hopefully that answers the question.
Thanks a lot, Simon. Unfortunately, we are starting to run out of time. We still have some questions there. We will look these through offline and see if we can get the answers to you in some other way. But at this point, we unfortunately don't have time for any more questions. If you are interested in this reading or hearing more about the Tideway project, we have Nigel's interview on our website, and you can go, we will send you the link after the webinar, and you can go check that out.
And next time we will have an interesting case as well. We have a case Copenhagen Airport on our webinar, and it's by Michael Ørsted. That's going to be on Wednesday, 12th of February. Put that day already on your calendar and register. And yes, Michael will talk about how they have improved the quality and process at Copenhagen Airport, and how they have been involved in developing own rules for Denmark's construction industry. That is super interesting, and you will get a registration link after this webinar. So if you have any questions to us, you can also send us later on through these emails. Thanks a lot, and see you next time.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Nigel, and thank you, Simon, and thank you for all the attendees. Hope to see you again in the next webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you.